We have just recently dealt with the roots of South African Afrikaner thought, and we now want to proceed to deal with the fruits of Calvinism in South Africa. We start dealing with the eschatology of victory in the history of the Afrikaner from 1652 through 1900. There's a lot that could be said here, so we'll have to restrict ourselves only to some of the highlights. Now, as we pointed out, in 1652, Dr. Johann van Riebeek, M.D., knelt down, bringing the first on the beach of Cape Town, bringing the first colonists with him, with the prayer that thy true Reformed Christian doctrine may be promulgated and disseminated throughout the land. He brought with him some preachers on the ship and some laymen to comfort the sick, just as Peter Stuyvesant went to New York, established the Dutch Reformed Church. So did Peter van der Staal, the first preacher, arrive in South Africa and establish the Reformed Church or Congregation at the Cape, answerable to and on behalf of the Presbytery of Amsterdam. Between 1700 and 1800, the colonists began to take root. Again, the Dutch Germans arrive in 1652. The French Huguenots start pouring in 1788. And more Dutchmen, and especially more Germans, arriving round about 1700. The colonists begin to take root, and for the first time we have a record here of a white South African who, when asked what he was, said, "Ek is een Afrikaner," that is, I am an Afrikaner. And he did not say, I am a Dutchman. I suppose there was a first time when a colonist in America said, I am an American. I'd like to know when that was. I should, but I don't. Anyway, round about 1700, we find white South African-born people claiming to be Afrikaners. The word Afrikaner, of course, means one who comes from Africa, and I think it's very interesting that white people in Africa were calling themselves Africans long before any black people in Africa knew what the word Africa meant. In 1700 and in the subsequent years, we find the native-born whites for the first time beginning to struggle against authoritarianism emanating from far away Holland. Just as in the United States, after a couple of generations, when you had a native-born white American population, they began to feel distant from England, and then when the British government got out of touch with what was happening in America, so that an American consciousness began to develop amongst the American whites, ultimately leading to severe dissatisfaction with England, and finally the American Declaration of Independence, so too in South Africa. From about 1710 onward, we begin to find some 60 years after the establishment of the white colony, the emergence of a South African white consciousness objecting to perceived authoritarianism of Holland, disliking intensely the autocracy of the foreign Dutch government, not liking many of the Dutch noblemen and wealthy people who were sent to South Africa from Holland to govern her for a while, which they regarded as being in conflict with their more democratic, I suppose is not too bad a word to use, frontier-type spirit, where every man was regarded as formerly the equal of every other civilized man, at any rate. Some of these governors that were sent by the Dutch to South Africa were not even full Dutchmen. There was one very objectionable individual called Willem Adrian van der Stel. He was born in Indonesia. His mother was black. His father was a white Dutchman. And of all people, this individual was appointed governor of South Africa by the Dutch government. Well, he was real autocratic and a tyrant and very much upset the people. And yet the people that he upset were not very large in number. If in the United States, or I should say if in North America, the white population of North America, once it was planted, rapidly expanded, not so much at the cradle, but particularly expanded through continuing emigration. The white colonization of South Africa after its initial establishment in 1652 and the arrival of the French Huguenots in 1688 hardly got any new feed-in whatsoever from Europe. I think what has kept a great deal of openness in white Americans toward white Europeans is the fact that there has, at any rate until just a few decades ago, continually been a constant flow of more and more Europeans to the United States. That has not been the case in South Africa. The South African whites, once they got rooted, were remote and aloof from Europe, with very little continuing feed-in other than autocratic European rulers and governors who'd come there for a 5 or 10-year term, not understand the people, and then have to be replaced by the Dutch to replace them with yet another autocratic and unsympathetic ruler. And so it was that the white population in South Africa reproduced not so much at the cradle, but especially through emigration from 1700 onward at a very tiny trickling pace compared to the flood with which immigrants kept on arriving in North America. In fact, by 1700, there were only 1,800 whites in the whole of South Africa. Together with 1,100 slaves, none of them slaves from Africa, all of them slaves that had been imported by Dutch slavers from Indonesia. However, we find the white-born people in the Cape becoming increasingly more dissatisfied with the Dutch colonial pressures from Holland, and it was especially the Huguenots, the people of French Calvinist descent, who were the most dissatisfied of all. Huguenots like Adam Tass, that is T-A-S, became more and more involved in moving for increasing measures of South African self-government, independence, and movement away from the Dutch control of the Cape. These were people who were sturdy, who had been founded in Calvin's Gallic Confession, which required the government to be godly in terms of the Ten Commandments. They perceived that the faraway Dutch government didn't seem to be coming over as godly as it should, at least in its dealings with the South Africans, and they began to say so more and more. It's interesting that the man that wrote the music for the South African national anthem, with which I shall conclude these series in a few lectures' time, Reverend M.L. de Villiers, is a man of French Huguenot descent. People that loved freedom. And so Huguenots like Adam Tass, with their strong law orientation, would appeal to Calvin, the Gallic Confession, to object against the tyranny of wayward Dutch governors and officials at the Cape, and they resisted it. Throughout the 18th century you had this. 1740, 1750, 1760, more and more dissatisfaction in and around Cape Town as people trekked over the mountains and over the rolling plains on into the arid heartland of South Africa. First of all, round the lush coastal regions, where there was adequate rainfall and where alone there was adequate rainfall. There you find the rise of the first white South African nationalism, a group known as the Cape Patriots. These were people who began requesting and then demanding more and more, at first token, but later real political representation in their own affairs, much as the American colonists began to agitate for this sort of thing also from about 1700, 1720 onward. Dates are surprisingly parallel in the two continents in the development of events. They felt that they wanted to be more autonomous in trading, and yet the Dutch mother country followed a closed trading pattern, wanting to saddle South Africa with Dutch items that the white South Africans didn't particularly want to buy. They'd prefer to buy, say, French goods or make them themselves. But this was leading up to a Boston Tea Party type situation, as you can see, comparable with what happened in America from 1770 to 1776. Around about 1780, just as the Americans were winning their independence, a very major event took place in South Africa. The dissatisfied white settlers, as they moved eastward and northward away from Cape Town at the southern tip of South Africa where I grew up, for the first time suddenly encountered black people that they had never seen before. And so the white man has been in southern Africa for 128 years before he meets the first black man. And he meets the first black man in the eastern portion of what is now South Africa, as the white man marches eastward and northward from Cape Town, and as the black man who has been moving down from East Africa southbound along the southeastern fringe of Africa, with other black tribes to the north of them pushing these advanced black tribes down into what is now South Africa. One day, as the eastward moving whites went over the brow of the next hill, and as the westward moving blacks came over the brow of the same hill, they looked at one another and couldn't believe their eyes. And so immediately, not understanding one another's language or culture, the whites being Christians and Calvinists and speaking European language, the blacks being half-naked, being pagans, though some of them to some extent being Muslims, and not understanding the white man's language, managed to make a deal that at the point where they met one another on those hills would be the boundary, that the white man would march no farther to the east or to the north, that the black man would march no farther to the west and to the south. And here is again your second phase in the development of racial segregation as the historical practice of South Africa, the way it emerged. Well, I think things might have gone well if it hadn't been for a handful of greedy white men who wanted to grab a little more land to the east and the north of that border, and more than a handful of starving black people who got wiped out to the next famine. Famines are very frequent in South Africa. Remember, it is desert. There's very little rain. And when the blacks had a crop failure, and when their cattle began to die, why they found it so convenient to raid the white neighbor's cattle and to round that up. Look, fellows, meat. And, of course, the white people were not very happy with having their cows burgled, and they took reprisals, and so this led from 1780 onward in the next couple of decades to the so-called 10 Kafir Wars. Now, the word Kafir is an Arabic word, kafir, meaning infidel or unbeliever. That is to say, one who is not a Muslim. When an Arab calls a person a kafir, a kafir, he means that the person to whom he is speaking is not a Muslim. From that point of view, we are all kafirs or kafirs. However, when the whites asked the blacks what the blacks were called, the blacks told the whites what the Arab slave traders had told the blacks. They said, "We are kafirs," meaning the light-skinned Semitic, Mohammedan Arab slavers have called us kafirs, kafirs. That is to say, non-Muslims or pagans. And so I really think that although today the word kafir in South Africa has become a word of abuse, which most black people resent, wrongly thinking and stupidly thinking that the white person calling them a kafir is implying that they're not Christians, all that would be implied is that they're not a Muslim. And certainly I would want to be a kafir, or a non-Muslim in that sense. It wasn't intended as a term of abuse at all, and it was a word that was suggested by the blacks to the whites as a suitable name to call the blacks, which name the blacks had learned not from the whites but from the Arab slavers. So there were 10 Kafir wars, or if you like, 10 black versus white wars. And these 10 wars ended rather conclusively in the destruction of the black military power and the dominance of the whites on the eastern frontier, but again with an honoring of the principle of a separate boundary between the black inhabited area to the northeast of the boundary and the white inhabited area to the southwest of this boundary. By 1795, there were 20,000 Afrikaans-speaking white people in South Africa. And I believe that this is an appropriate place at which we can quote the Encyclopedia Britannica in its articles on South Africa, which I may say are very biased against South Africa, and that makes this, the weight of what I'm about to cite, all the more impressive. 1973, the liberal Encyclopedia Britannica in its article of South Africa says, and I quote, although all of the white people who were trekking northward and eastward through South Africa were extreme individualists, and some were ruffians, most of them did contrive to preserve a sound domestic morality. In other words, they had an honorable family life. They strove to preserve a smattering of literacy, and then the Encyclopedia Britannica says, deprecatingly, they read almost only the Bible and their catechisms. I can't think of better things to read than the Bible and the catechisms. And they did also preserve a respect for their religion, a rather strict form of Calvinism. Unquote, the Encyclopedia Britannica. Well, I'm proud to have a description like that, even though it wasn't intended to be a compliment. But these movements continued. And so various republics began to be set up as the discontent of the white South African with the faraway autocratic Dutch mother country increased. I think it's significant that the first republics were set up by white South Africans in South Africa for white South Africans at the very time that Holland succumbed to the French Revolution and after that to Napoleon. I don't believe that the white South Africans have sufficient historical insight to understand the terrible plight that Mother Holland was going through at this time, as the Dutch Calvinist monarchy was being destroyed and overrun, first by these liberal leftists and then by the autocrat, bizarre, viciously anti-Dutch and anti-Calvinistic Napoleon. But at the time that Holland was going under, at this same time the South Africans reached the end of their tether. They moved farther and farther afield from Cape Town up into the desert and the grasslands, and they established what they called the Republic of Swellendam, approximately 300 miles dead east of Cape Town. My parents lived just over the mountains to the north of Swellendam at a town called Barrydale. And they also trekked still farther, a couple of hundred miles still farther, and they set up a second republic, which they called the Republic of Graaf Reinet. This is a very important town on the very edge of the desert. Today it is a great, powerful center of Calvinist education. It became so as a result of the godly Andrew Murray, whom you've all heard about, I'm sure, writer of devotional literature, who was born in Graaf Reinet in the manse of the church which his father pastored. They have a very ancient grapevine growing in the manse garden to this very day, which was there when Andrew Murray was a little boy at the beginning of the 19th century, and which vine is still producing grapes even today, although they're a little small and a little bitter. So then, this is the picture which we begin to receive. Back in the mother country, or I should say one of the chief mother countries, Holland, 1795, Holland falls to the French Revolution and then to Napoleon. Roman Dutch Calvinist law is abolished in Holland by the occupying French troops and replaced with a Napoleonic code. That severely cut South Africa off from Holland, because after the liberalization of law in Holland, South Africa continued with the old primitive Calvinistic Roman Dutch law of Calvin and Fuchsius that I've been talking about. Some Dutch conservatives that weren't destroyed in Holland fled to South Africa, to refuge where they could continue their primitive Calvinism. In 1803, Holland was so fearful of an expansion of French Napoleonic influence, even as far as the southern tip of Africa, that Holland sold the Cape to the British. It has been alleged that the British never paid for it, and that's a very sore point in South Africa to this day. But be that as it may, Holland did try to sell it to the British so as to prevent it from falling into the hands of the French Navy. And so the British arrived in South Africa, and they occupied the country and made many sweeping changes from 1803 through 1820. The British brought printing, books, newspapers, exposure to outside ideas, to British ways of doing things, liberal ideas, although ideas that were less liberal, coming from England then, than were the ideas of the French Revolution, or even than were the ideas of the Frenchified Dutch situation back in Holland. But be that as it may, this wave of new ideas, this time under the British, caused ever-increasing dissatisfaction in South Africa. The British were determined to destroy the Afrikaans language. They suppressed this language in the schools, forced little children who couldn't understand a word of English to learn English alone in the schools, trying to wipe out their past and their history and their culture. The British immediately introduced British law into the law courts, at least as far as criminal law and criminal procedure is concerned. They made English alone the language of the law courts. This was highly resented by the Afrikaners, who wanted to preserve their Roman Dutch system of law. And to crown it all, the British tried to force the Afrikaners to abandon Afrikaans as the language of their churches. It was at this point that the British, first of all, tried to persuade the Afrikaners to become Episcopalians or Anglicans. They met with stern, severe Presbyterian resistance. And then the British hit upon the next best program, and that is, well, if we can't Episcopalianize them, at least we'll get them to speak English the way in which we've got the Scottish in Scotland to speak English in spite of Presbyterianism. They suddenly realized that Presbyterianism was and Calvinism was the dominant religion both of Scotland and of South Africa. And so guess what? The British then imported hordes of Scottish, of English-speaking Presbyterian ministers from Scotland and shoved them onto the South African pulpits. This was highly resented because up to the British occupation of the Cape, the South African people had been used to have their own sessions of elders nominate whom they wanted to call to be their preacher, which needed to be approved by the congregation. But here was a foreign government statistically cramming preachers down the throats of the people without even asking the people whether they wanted the preachers. And these preachers coming from Scotland, though Calvinists, couldn't speak one word of Afrikaans. And at first they started preaching in English from the pulpit. The situation got so bad that at one stage, more than half of all the preachers on the South African Reformed pulpits were English-speaking Scots Presbyterians, and less than half of the preachers on the South African pulpits were Afrikaans-speaking South African preachers trained in Holland, or from this time on trained locally at Stellenbosch University, where I received my own training. But what the British didn't bargain for, and what happened, was the very opposite of what the British had wanted to happen. It had been their desire that the English-speaking Scottish Presbyterian preachers would persuade their Afrikaans-speaking South African audiences in the pew to abandon the Afrikaans language and to accept English. But the opposite happened. The Scottish, English-speaking Scottish preachers began to learn Afrikaans, and to the horror of the British government, began to preach the gospel of Calvinism in Afrikaans, which they learned as the language of the people. And so today, if you look at the Reformed churches of South Africa, along with the Van der Merwers and the Van der Westhuizens and the Van der Stelts, as the preachers, you also have the Reverend McGregors and the Reverend Robertsons and the Reverend McFarlanes and the Reverend Mac something else, and especially the Reverend Murrays, Andrew Murrays, and I don't know how many preachers in Reformed pulpits in South Africa today, scores of them, bear the name of Murray and are direct descendants of Andrew Murray and his brothers and his father and his father's brothers, who came from Scotland to South Africa to settle there and to preach the gospel. And so then, we find the absorption of this Scottish element into Afrikanerdom at this point. But the dissatisfaction continued. And I think the roof finally blew off it when in 1836, as a result of the work of William Wilberforce in England, slaves were abolished throughout what was then called the British Empire. And there was a proclamation of the liberation of slavery, and although it is true that the proclamation in South Africa made provision for the compensation in terms of money of the slave owner who would lose his slave. The fact is that the abolition of slaves was forced upon the slave owners without them being consulted, and perhaps sadder still, very, very few slave owners received any compensation for the loss of their slaves, even though they had been promised that this would be so. And this final difficulty made the Afrikaner people explode and decide to abandon Cape Town and the British in the southwestern corner of South Africa, and to trek even more northward into the center of South Africa and more toward the east. Here again we find in the Encyclopedia Britannica a quotation from the Afrikaner woman Anna Steenkamp, Steenkamp. She said, "The British have placed our slaves on an equal footing with Christians, contrary to the laws of God and the natural distinctions of race and religion, so that it was intolerable for any decent Christian to bow down beneath such a yoke. This is why we withdrew from the British in Cape Town, in order to preserve our doctrines in purity." You may find a reference to that in Michener's book on the people of the covenant, but bear in mind these people have been promised compensation for the forcible expropriation of their slaves, many of whom didn't want to be expropriated anyway. They'd been financially ruined by the British, and the Afrikaners had had it up to here with the British. They'd had their language challenged, their Roman Dutch Calvinistic law system challenged, they'd had their churches invaded, they'd had their children anglicized in the schools, and now they'd been financially ruined. They'd had enough, and so off they trekked. Now let me read to you again that poem with which I concluded the last lecture, and in the light of these grievances, it will perhaps take on a new meaning to you. The white child treks into South Africa, treks on into the land, both wide and far as he can see, until the night, and farther still, when the next dawn gets light. Trek on. We're not yet far enough. Let's trek. How far? As far as God would have us trek. And as they trekked, they went and settled in the beautiful and fertile coastal region of Natal and established the Republic of Natal as a Calvinist white republic in the southeastern portion of South Africa, and they negotiated that land and got it by treaty with the approval of the powerful black Zulu nation. Now the Zulu nation had been the scourge of all of the black tribes. They had been butchering and annihilating one black tribe after another and driving them further and further south into South Africa, and finally the Zulus had themselves arrived in what is now the northern portion of southeast South Africa. And so Piet Retief, the Afrikaner leader, together with some 70 other men, went to the Zulu king's headquarters and sat down at his invitation to sign a peace treaty. But when a sign was given, the Zulu king had all of the whites murdered while signing the peace treaty, together with all of the non-whites who were with the whites and who were associated with the whites in colonizing this new area. Then the Zulu king sent out his ferociously and excellently trained troops northward and annihilated 300 defenseless white women, with only one escaping with spears sticking out of her body, riding away from this place which became known henceforth as Vietnam, the place of weeping, some 20 miles from the place where I had my last pastorate in South Africa. Also some 15 miles from the place where Sir Winston Churchill was arrested by Afrikaner troops in the South African War some 70 years ago. And Churchill, this just an aside, was blown up with the British troop train, taken captive, and locked up in a house just 3 miles from my manse. And then, of course, he managed to get a disguise as a woman and escaped, and later became the Prime Minister of England. But that's another story. At any rate, after this massacre of these 300 women, it became painfully obvious to the people of the covenant that they would have no peace with the black Zulu nation that had butchered all the other black tribes before them. And realizing the imminence of slaughter, the godly Reformed elder Sarul Sulyi, in the company of the 536 armed adult males, which is all that the trekkers had at their disposal, climbed onto a wagon and made the covenant with Almighty God. And he stood up and asked the people to remove their hats, and he said, "Here we stand today before a holy God of heaven and earth, but we promise him that if he will give us the victory in the slaughter tomorrow, that we will dedicate that day, the 16th of December, to be a holy Sabbath for us and our children unto all future generations. And if he spares us, we will build a temple of worship to his honor on this spot. And we will Christianize and evangelize these our black enemies that are bent on annihilating us, for the honor of his name will be served and praised in this way." And the next day the Zulu armies attacked, and they came hurtling and screaming down across the river, all 15,000 of them, against a mere 536 white Afrikaner Calvinists. And early in the morning, there had been a heavy dew, very unusual for an arid country like South Africa, and the gunpowder was so damp that it wouldn't work. But in their extremity, the white Afrikaners called out to God for mercy, and the sun came out, and the gunpowder was dry, and the battle was joined, and no Afrikaners were killed. 3 were lightly wounded, and 10,000 of the 15,000 Zulu troops were slaughtered and fell into the river until it turned red with their blood, and has been called to this day Umzinyathi in Zulu, the Battle of Blood River. Well, you may agree with Mitchener, but frankly, I see in that the battles of Joshua and of David's heroes against overwhelming odds, and to be understood in the same light that the Lord God of our fathers will be faithful unto our children and our children's children. And so there's only one special day in South Africa today, apart from Sunday, which is a Sabbath. And that special day, which is also a Sabbath, is the 16th of December, to commemorate not the slaughter of helpless blacks, but to commemorate God's preservation of the civilizing Calvinist civilization, which just happened to be white. And not only did those people build a temple at that spot to honor Almighty God, but they did more. They took contributions from the white Calvinists, and they erected at the headquarters of the Zulu king, who had murdered their white leaders, a theological seminary for black people, financed by white money, built in the form of an ox head, the symbol of the Zulu army, with a huge cement cross rising up in its midst to symbolize the cross hath triumphed over the powers of darkness. If that be racism, then I must confess to being a racist without any feeling of shame. But I feel it is not racism. I believe it is the triumph of Christianity and civilization over the powers of darkness. And I look forward to a happier day in the future when white Calvinists and black Calvinists in South Africa and elsewhere can stand as brothers shoulder to shoulder against the new forces of darkness, the white atheistic scum of the earth associated with the black and the yellow non-Christians. Let the line be drawn where it needs to be drawn in every generation, where unbelief confronts belief. And if incidentally in a certain day and age the line of belief should coincide with the line of race, well, then we'll have to accept that position as a point of departure. But as soon as possible, let it be understood that the line of belief goes through the heart of every man regardless of his skin color, as the Word of God continues in its onward course throughout the world to civilize it. And what shall we say further? 1840 through 1850, the British annexed the Natal Republic and drove the white South Africans out, drove them into the very center of South Africa, to the Orange River colony, where ultimately, at the Sand River Convention, the British finally signed a peace treaty with the white South Africans, allowing the white South Africans to set up their independent Afrikaner Calvinistic republic, the Orange Free State. And then, in 1857, recognizing a second Afrikaner Calvinist republic to the north of the Vaal River and south of the Zambezi, to be known as the South African Republic. These two republics had rigid Calvinist constitutions. Even the British constitutional expert Lord Bryce, in his great book on the constitutions of the British Empire of Nations, admits that the Orange Free State Republic is a model constitution of constitutional government. And everything went well in South Africa until in 1867 diamonds were discovered on the Caledon River. Immediately the British moved to grab the diamonds, stirred up certain non-white people called the Griqua people to claim it for themselves, whereas they'd never even been there, and then offered to establish a British protectorate over those non-white people. And so Griqualand West, the place where the diamonds were discovered, in what was technically the Orange Free State Republic of the white South African Calvinists, was forcibly incorporated into the British Empire as a British protectorate. Even the Encyclopedia Britannica admits today that the British did wrong in what they did at that time. And that's how Kimberley, the greatest center of diamond production in the whole world, was removed from the Orange Free State Republic and incorporated into the British-controlled Cape Colony. The Afrikaners moved on, establishing new republics ever farther to the north. The Stellaland Republic, the Goshen Republic, which they got from Exodus chapter 1, the Republic of Freedom, Freiheit Republic, the Leidenburg Republic, the Rustenburg Republic, the Lichtenberg Republic, the Zoutpansberg Republic, and the Far Northern Republic. Until in 1886, gold was discovered on the ridge of the White Waters in what is now Johannesburg. People poured in from all parts of the world, and exports trebled from the South African Republic, where the gold was discovered, in the 1870s compared to the exports in the 1860s. Exports rose again 7 times between then and 1900. By 1910, gold had replaced the gold represented 60% of all of the wealth of South Africa, and diamonds a further 20%. From 1875 onward, Lord Carnarvon, representing the British government, and Sir Theophilus Shepstone, the governor of Natal, which the British, you remember, had annexed from the old Calvinistic white South African Natal Republic, made a plot with one another against the Orange Free State Republic, whose freedom from Britain had been guaranteed by the British at the Sand River Convention of 1852. And they attacked the Orange Free State, and especially the South African Republic to the north of the Vaal River, leading to the First South African War. And they defeated South Africa in 1877. But in 1881, the South Africans rose again against the British, and after bloody battles defeated the British, the Battle of Majuba and elsewhere, and regained their independence by wiping out the British armies, establishing their independence, which was recognized at the London Convention of 1884. Then a brand new factor entered onto the scene in 1885. Everyone had had a slice of Africa. The British had grabbed a piece in the southwest. The Belgians had grabbed the Belgian Congo. The French had carved out for themselves large portions of West Africa and Central Africa, and the Germans decided that they wanted a slice of the pie too. And so the Germans started a colony in what is today Tanzania, which was then called Tanganyika, on the east coast of Africa, and another colony was established on the west coast of southern Africa in an area called Southwest Africa, and today called Namibia, Deutsche Südwestafrika. It was the aim of the Germans to drive a wedge from their western colony of Southwest Africa through Central Africa to link up with their eastern colony in Tanganyika. Cecil John Rhodes, the British governor in Cape Town, wanted to drive his wedge for Britain from Cape Town in the south all the way through to Cairo in the north. And the race was on as to whether the Germans would cut Africa in two from west to east before the British cut Africa in two from north to south to prevent the Germans. And unfortunately for the British, an independent Calvinist republic stood in the way. The colossal figure of Paul Kruger, Gower, Calvinist president of the South African Republic, who would not permit the British troops to march through his territory on account of the war that they had had previously and with their ancestors on several occasions. And the British were irked and saw the time passing away as the Germans were linking up Africa from east to west. And so finally as tension increased and increased, and as more and more foreigners seeking gold and making their fortunes poured into the South African Republic, and as discontent was fomented there more and more, it became clear that a showdown was ahead between the South African Republic and the Orange Free State Republic on the one hand, and the entire British Empire, England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand on the other. War broke out on October the 11th, 1899. War between the whole British Empire on the one hand and the tiny little South African Republic and Orange Free State Republic on the other hand. The war lasted for 3 years. Britain fielded 250,000 troops in the course of 3 years. There were never more than 20,000 farmers on the side of the South Africans to oppose 250,000 troops. That's a pretty great disproportion. The amazing thing is that the war lasted for 3 years. As a matter of fact, General Smuts, of whom I shall say something in the next lecture or two, became so adept at guerrilla warfare that he even invaded the Cape and got to within sight of Cape Town when the war finally ground to its end, as the white South Africans were starved of supplies and of food. The British would move into the farms, would burn down the farms to the ground, would herd up and round up the women and the children of the South African soldiers who were away fighting at the front into concentration camps behind barbed wire. Some would say even gave them doses of copper sulfate. At any rate, 26,400 white South African Calvinist women and children perished miserably. A huge slice of such tiny nation in the British concentration camps. And South Africa was finally defeated, succumbing with a few troops to the entire cream of all the soldiery of the entire British Empire. And so it seemed in 1902 that Calvinism was finished in South Africa at the Calvary of the death of the South African Republic. But you know, there are 2 monuments in South Africa today. One is that of a man wounded by a dagger in his side with the blood pouring down, with the words underneath it, "Conquered but not vanquished." And the other is a monument to the 26,400 Calvinist Afrikaner women and children who perished in the concentration camps, invented not by the Germans in World War II against the Jews, but invented for the first time in history by the British against a civilized white South African Calvinist nation in 1900. And outside of Bloemfontein, the capital of the Orange Free State, and its university, one of the biggest Calvinist universities in the world today, where I had the privilege of getting my second doctor's degree, there is this monument to the women and children that perished. It's a very moving monument, cast in cast iron, of an Afrikaner woman looking out ahead of her with no husband, holding on to the Bible in her hand, with her little children, tattered and torn, clinging to their mother's leg. And at the feet of this monument, there is a tribute to a noble Englishwoman, a wonderful nurse called Emily Hobhouse, whose name is revered in South Africa to this day, and who took care, as best she could, of those dying and starving Afrikaner women and children in the British concentration camps. But I think the most moving thing of all at that monument is not even the tribute to this wonderful Christian nurse of the enemy of the South African, Emily Hobhouse, who is greatly honored. But it is a Bible plaque next to this statue of the woman and the children in tatters, with a quotation there from Hebrews chapter 13. "I shall never leave thee. I shall never desert thee." And so after the Calvary of defeat came the resurrection of the Afrikaner nation and its Calvinism. But about that, more in the next lecture.